Thank you so much, Christy. And thank you again to all of you for being here and for sticking around to hear me talk at you again. So now I'm actually going to talk about what I do at Google. So my name is Clara, in case you weren't here earlier, and I am a UX researcher on Google's material design team, which is our design system. You can follow me on Twitter. I think the lighting isn't great, but first, it's in the program, but first initial, last name, no hyphen. And you can read more about material design at material.io. So my talk is essentially about how teams are working together, and specifically design teams, design development teams, and how you can do similar research either within your own design and development teams or for other user groups that you work with. And briefly run through a little bit about me, some of the methods that we use to do this research, a couple of lessons from those methods, and then what it means for working together more effectively as designers and developers and other product people, and then what's next. So, about me. I am a cognitive scientist by training. I have an undergrad degree in that, and focused on psycholinguistics and visual perception for a while. And then towards the end of my time in undergrad, I became very interested in UX and how people make things and what research can drive that. So I joined a healthcare company in Boston, Massachusetts in the US where we made tools for doctors and nurses and other people in the clinical sphere. And I did UX design research for them for a couple of years. And as I talked about earlier, that's the time at which I also started Ladies UX Boston and became more involved in UX groups there. And then a couple of years later, I decided I wanted to try something new and moved to California. And I joined a really tiny startup as their first UX person, where I did design and research, and we were building AI tools. It was a very, very cool place. And I was there for a couple of years also. And then I decided that I wanted to specialize in research again and go somewhere a little bit bigger, or really a lot bigger. And I ended up at Google. So I've been at Google a bit over a year now. On the material team, and it's been really fun, and I'm really excited to share some of what we've been up to. So how many of you have heard of or have used material design? Awesome, so a good chunk of you. And for those who are less familiar, material is Google's design system. It's also available externally. As I said, I guess you can't see it, but there's a link down here, material.io. And if you go to that website, you'll see that there's a bunch of guidance on design components, so things like buttons and form fields and how to use them. Icons, and then also design tools, including a tool we make called Gallery, which is used for sharing designs, and a bunch of other stuff that you can have a look at there. And material is, our team is a group of designers, engineers, researchers, product managers, and a number of other functions. And as researchers, we focus on evaluating a lot of the things up here, but we also think more broadly about how do designers and developers collaborate. The entire end-to-end experience for product teams, for building things together. And collaboration is really more than just how you work together, but it's also the tasks you perform, whom you're working with, and the tools that you're using to accomplish that. So I'll share with you some of what we've learned through our investigations into this space to answer those questions, and also talk a little bit about how you can try it on your own. So to that effect, methods. So, okay, another picture that you maybe can't see super well, but this is triangulating methods. So there are a lot of different ways to get at that question of designer-developer collaboration. And we did three things primarily. We do three things primarily. We've done a lot of work in interviews, so in-depth interviews with designers, developers, other people, to really understand what are their processes and how do they think about the design process, how do they use design systems and tools. We also saw themes coming out of these, and we've run surveys to help validate them and also expose new themes, ideas, trends that we might want to explore in other ways, and sort of see how widespread certain things are. And then we also wanted to move beyond the individual perspective that you get from these these interviews and these surveys, but really look at the team perspective. What is the nature of team collaboration? And in order to do that, we ran these mapping workshops, which were collaborative participatory activities that we ran with teams. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few minutes. So these workshops the main goal was understanding how do designers and developers collaborate, and what isn't working in their process, or what isn't working in general. So these workshops were 3 hours, and we did a series of activities to get at the heart of this matter. So there were a fair number of factors in how we selected teams, but a couple of the ones that I want to call out here are thinking about different differentiators like location, team size, products that they work on, and roles. So when I say location, I mean not only where in the world were these teams, but also things like geodistribution. And this goes back to what some of you were talking about earlier. When everybody is in the same room, how is that similar to or different than when everybody is on a different continent, or you have some people in one room and some people scattered in different places? Thinking about team size, some teams are 5 people doing something together, and some are 20 people who might be split up across a bunch of other teams as well. Products, so thinking about things like mobile, but also enterprise, desktop, or even hardware. And then roles, and not just the roles involved, because most teams had this group of designers, engineers, and PMs, but also different kinds of designers, or different ratios of designers to engineers. So these were different things that we were looking for when we were thinking about which teams we wanted to do this work with. So this 3-hour workshop consisted of 3 primary activities that were framed around exploring several questions within a typical project. So we said to everybody, think about a typical project and think about what did you do first, what did you do last, what happened in between those 2 points, who were you doing it with, and which tools did you use to accomplish it. So our first activity was an individual mapping workflow. So we had people actually sit down and sketch out their process. So something like this, where you ideate and then you're creating wireframes, sort of thinking about what's involved with that. And the reason that we did this was because it helps get people in the right mindset and sort of thinking about drawing and sketching and sort of how to articulate their workflow in this piecewise way. And then it also set them up for the next activity, which was building out a team workflow. So this one might be hard to see as well, but if not, the next thing that we had people do was list out all the roles involved. So the roles in the room, which were typically some combination of designers, engineers, and product managers, but it could also be researchers, it could also be content strategists, there might be other people as well. But then also thinking about who isn't in the room. What kinds of people do you partner with? Are there other teams, other functions, or who are your stakeholders? And then also thinking about the phases. So that question of what do you do first and what do you do last? And when people shared out their individual diagrams, it was really interesting to hear often from a role perspective, about how everybody thought about the phases of their workflow and how that might be different. And then how we could really coalesce those into a larger team-wise one. So we had them create this framework. And then we had them add in their tasks. So these are supposed to represent sticky notes. But we basically had them tag within each phase, what is each role doing, if anything. Sometimes they might not be doing things. And having them do this as a group, let them actually identify parts of the workflow framework that either needed to be combined or new phases that they might not have been thinking about. But it was really interesting to see how they came together to sort of think about what do they do and what might they be missing from an individual perspective that they can get as a team. Next, we had them add tools. So the pink, if you can see it, is the tool sticky note, and the blue is the task. So this was an interesting way to get a sense of where are tools and tasks, how do they interplay? Is it sort of one tool per task? Is it many tools per task, many tasks per tool? And really try to get a picture of what is part of the workflow, both in terms of what they're doing and what they're using. So that was the second part, building out this team framework. And now the third part was actually looking at pain. So we wanted to understand what isn't working here, or where do they perceive the pain. So we asked everybody to take a couple of these red dots, and we had them put them on different parts of the workflow. It could be on a task, it could be on a tool, so it could be something they really don't like doing. It could be a tool they really don't like using. It could be in a space, an empty space, because maybe there's something they wish they were doing that nobody does. And then we had them rank each of these on a scale of 1 to 5. So 1 is mildly annoying, and 5 is like the most frustrating thing ever in your workflow. And then we created this map that showed where is the distribution of pain across the workflow? And this was interesting because you can start to slice it by task, by phase, by tool, by role, by other things in here. And I want to take a step back and just say that this is something, obviously we were doing this around design teams, but this is something you can apply more broadly within other teams or groups of users you might be studying to understand what's causing problems and then how you might want to address it. So this was the major artifact that we ended up with, but I will say as well that there was a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion, and this was being continuously annotated and edited throughout the 3 hours that we were developing it together as a group. So why is this approach useful? Why did we do this? Well, I think there are 3 things here that were really useful to us as researchers. First of all, it allowed us to understand individual roles, but also team perspectives. So if you think about that triangle I showed you at the beginning, and the broader scope of the methods, so you have the the interviews, the deep dives, you have the surveys, which give you kind of a latitudinal view of what's going on. And then and those are really the individual perspective. But this allows you to capture the team as well, team mentality. It also gives you a lot of different granularities of data. So we have a bunch of different teams, and then we can look at pain along a lot of different axes, including role and tool and phase and task. And then it's also similar to contextual inquiry in that it's an immersive experience that allows us to understand how do teams collaborate and how do they talk about it, how are they articulating that. I also wanted to speak briefly about how we analyze the data, because with 3-hour workshops, running 8 of them, and having lots of discussion and maps, we had 24 hours of data, if you can quantify it in that way. A lot of data. So I was working with another researcher on this, and we had a list of pain points. There are other things we did too, but critically, we had a list of pain points, and we each then went off and coded them independently. So basically, a couple of words or a phrase to describe what do we think is happening in each pain point. How would we categorize them? But this other researcher and I had done this independently, so we had a bunch of different codes. So we got back together and we aligned our code book, meaning that we said, okay, what's the common language that we're using to explain how we see the pain? So now we had a common language, but we still might have different perspectives on what was happening with the pain points, what codes aligned to them. So we went back and recoded them with this common code book. And then we had a resolution where we said, okay, this is definitely the codes you're using, and these are definitely the pain points we're attaching them to. Or other way around, I guess, you know what I mean. So that allowed us to produce a bunch of different graphs and ways to summarize where we saw the biggest moments of pain, the biggest themes. And it was an interesting way to quantify qualitative data. So definitely time consuming, but I think fairly productive approach for researching and for analyzing. So to move on, let's talk about what we found. So obviously, there were a lot of things that came out of this, but I'll focus on 5 lessons that came both out of these mapping workshops as well as looking at more broadly at the other research that we did. So first of all, despite structural and functional differences, so thinking about teams as both different types of people on the teams, different locations, different products they're working on, different ratios, we learned that everybody follows a very similar design process. So the way we got here is that we had those maps that we showed you, and we had the phases on top, and then we looked at what are the common phases, how are they talking about them, and how can we roll them up into kind of a meta map, a metaphase. So we abstracted out a common team process. So there was basically a moment where everybody agreed on what they're doing. There's a kickoff of some kind. It could be a meeting, it could be something else. Then there's this initial design cycle of initial designs and iterations. Then there's a final design cycle of final designs and iterations. So you're getting from something preliminary into something that's more ready, more polished and ready for production. And then there's a moment of handoff and implementation in QA. So we also abstracted out a bunch of common tasks here. These are not fully representative. There's definitely other stuff that happens and certainly things that might not happen for everyone. But basically thinking about what is a team doing together versus what's the responsibility of individual roles. And also thinking more broadly about how do these differ when you think about there are 3 different kinds of designers on this team, or there's one designer who's doing everything. So you can see here that there's also the roles of stakeholders that they change over time. So initially they might be consulted, but then later they're trying to approve things. So anyway, we built this general kind of process that sums up what we saw across all these different workflows. The other thing that was interesting, though, was where we saw pain. So I think a lot of the conversations in the design world, and maybe even in the design tools world, focus around this moment of handoff. So how do you get something out of a spec, final design, and into code? What does that look like? And we definitely saw pain there. There are definitely a lot of questions around, is this the right spec? And does the spec was implemented correctly, and those kinds of things. But we also saw a lot of pain earlier in the design process. So a lot of questions around designers and developers not being in alignment. What happens, going back again to some of the remote work stuff, what happens when people aren't in the same room to make the same decisions together? How are those decisions communicated? How are things being shared? So what this said to us is that while there's a lot of discussions around these final stages, we also need to be paying attention to what's happening earlier. And especially when you think about teams that are becoming increasingly remote, and the way that we work together continues to evolve, making sure that we're thinking about our creation processes as much as we're thinking about the handoff. Second, okay, and this is where things, I like to use fancy colors here, but they're not showing up, so I'm just going to tell you what it says. So the second point is that teams seek a single source of truth. So I think there's this idea that there are too many tools out there. There are too many design tools that different people have to keep track of. Sometimes designers love having lots of different tools, but maybe engineers say, well, I don't know which tool is the right one. Maybe there's certain things that you want to accomplish in one tool, but you have to use 3 different ones to do that. So there's this problem of too many tools. And we heard this manifesting when we asked people, where's the latest design? We heard a lot of things. We heard maybe it's in a deck. Maybe it's in the design tool. Maybe it was already implemented. That'd be nice. Maybe someone took a photo of a whiteboard in a meeting, and maybe they didn't take a photo. Maybe it was on the whiteboard and then it got erased. And there's lots of other places. And it was interesting because sometimes we asked the same people on a team this question and they gave different answers. So what this really says to me is that there isn't always a single source of truth, but this is one of the things that teams find themselves really needing. And that's something that I think we can all be thinking about. How do we point towards a specific place where people can find the artifacts they need? And I will also add that as a result of having all these tools, it means that artifacts also fracture into lots of different places. And that's why you end up with, these are all like good possible answers. It's not just that necessarily people don't know where to look, but that there may well be different things living in all these places. But I would also argue that what this says is it's not which design tools you use, but how well they work together. So that was my answer to the question that Christy asked me earlier. I think this is one of the most important things that I've learned through this research, that there is a lot of valid debate about different design tools, and I do not want to discredit that. But I also think that it's important to think about how do these tools fit together? How do they link, especially in a drive to solve that source of truth problems? So one designer told me, the least amount of tools my teammates have to look at, the better. Sorry? Yes, so we can play Mad Libs, but the spoiler here is it says the least amount of tools my teammates have to look at, the better. And I think that this person is saying 2 things. First of all, teammates should know where to find the most up-to-date designs. There's no question. This is the source of truth. Ideally, there would be, for this person, there would be one place. But the other thing that they're saying here is that they, as a designer, might need multiple tools to build whatever it is they're building. And for them, that's okay. As long as that gets collapsed into a single place where their teammates, the engineers, or the other designers or stakeholders they might need to review with, know where to go. Another Mad Lib for you. Designers use the tools that their teammates use. So we saw an effect in our research of tools, tool use being driven by teammates. So a common sentiment that we heard was, I don't want to redo work in multiple places, so I will prioritize the tools that other people on my team, designers or engineers, are using, because this makes it easier for me. So if I'm a designer and I'm using design tool A and another designer is using design tool B, I could redo the work that they're doing when it comes over to me to build on, but that's just not a good use of my time. So we saw a lot of people saying that they look and they ask, what are other people doing, and then that's the tools that they go with, even if they may personally have a preference for something else. And then the fifth lesson, which seems obvious, but I think is still really important, is that process and communication are key. Doing activities like this one certainly were helpful to us to understand how designers and developers work together and what isn't working. And it was also helpful for us to see how they talked about their process and sort of how they were aware or unaware of each other's perspectives. But for many of these teams themselves, this was the first time, or one of the first times, that they had really taken the time to think about this and articulate it and understand as one role maybe, what do other roles do that I'm not aware of? And how can I make sure that I know about that when I collaborate with them in the future? And really exposing, we have 10 different tools and we need to keep track of all of them. Or we have one tool that is doing triple duty and maybe that's not how we should be using it. There's this task that's really repetitive that maybe we can try to not do as often. Whatever the outcome is, this was really an opportunity for many of these teams to actually start to think about and articulate these things. So I think that it cannot be understated how important communication is in collaborating effectively. So what does this mean more broadly? Well, working together more effectively. So how many of you have done a team retrospective, say, in the last 6 months? Okay, good. So good number of you. And I think that this is definitely a good process. If you work with a team, this is a good process. But even if you don't have the time to do a full retrospective, I think there are things you can be thinking about in a more minimal capacity if you don't have time for, say, a formal retrospective or formal workshop. So more Mad Libs. Evaluate your team's blank and blank. Evaluate your team's tools and processes. So some things that are important to think about are, how do you get from idea to implementation? So what are those initial things that you do? And when you're getting ready to hand off, what happens there? And then what happens when you're done? What does done mean? I feel like this is a question that designers talk about a lot. How do you know when your design is done? Is it ever done? But what does your team think about that? Not just what is your personal articulation on it. What's working and what isn't? And what can you be doing to improve it? And you don't have to have all the answers at once. So some of the teams we talked to were trying experiments where every couple of weeks they might try a different way to communicate something, they might have a different kind of meeting, and they would just see how it went and then reflect back on it at some later point. But really just being flexible in your workflow and being willing to try different things. And then the perennial question of tools, because I think this is really important. How many tools is enough? And how do your tools work together? Do your tools work together? And is that okay or not? I think in this sense, we can all be researchers. You can use this kind of activity or process to assess your own work. But so this meaning, you can't see it, the one I showed you earlier. So if you have 3 hours, we have to do a lighter weight version of this, but if you have the time, you can definitely, I think there is some value in mapping out all of the different people that you work with and all the different things you do and sort of see what common things you find and also what assumptions you're making about your process and your team's process and having a discussion about that. But you can also do something a little bit lighter weight. You can be thinking about running small surveys, potentially. You can just have these kinds of team discussions where you identify a metric you'd like to track and then do these little experiments to try to get there. But as long as you're having a line of communication, then that's already making a difference. But thinking about ourselves as researchers who are studying our own teams and trying different things and trying experiments, I think will help us evolve a more harmonious designer-developer collaboration. So, in sum, we've talked about a lot, and I'd like to take a step back and go over some of the key things. So, I described a participatory method that captures both team and individual perspectives. And I think that this method, as I said, it's a 3-hour method, but you can definitely reduce it, either for your own team or if you're studying another group, whether it's designers or developers or other industries, other roles within industries in which you work. Thinking about how your tools and your team collaborate together is more important than thinking about is more important than which tools you use. So it's critical to look at your workflow and how the tools that you work with collaborate, than just saying, this is the best tool. That's my view on it. And then studying your team is a good way to make sure that you're continually improving your process. So lastly, what's coming next? So I think that as the workflow changes, as we see design tools ever evolve, as we see more team setups, as more people go remote, maybe there's more geo-distribution, it will be interesting to continue researching this place and see how things change and how we can continue to work together more collaboratively, better, and be sensitive to these different changing environments. And we are also doing some research, and we invite you to help us with it. We're running a survey on design tools. I don't know if this QR code is going to show up. There is also a link. It is GOOGLE.com/2MIML74. It is a survey about design tools, so if you're interested, feel free to take that. And we'll be sharing our findings on Google Design, which is Google's design website. We'll have some blog posts up there as we get the findings in. So definitely happy to chat more about that afterwards. And I want to say thank you for listening and for bearing with the slide issues here. So feel free to take the survey, and I also want to give a big thank you to my team and my managers for all their support here. And all of you for coming. Thank you. Yes.
We are women running a conference, we are ahead of schedule. If we ran the trains, imagine.
Happy to, yeah. Any questions?
Any questions? I still want to know what your favorite tool is. Just your preference, just
what
you find most nice for some reason.
Actually, I think that I use them for a lot, and I use them extensively in activity. I fold them into paper cranes. I write my ideas on them. They're great.
Do you want to know what my favorite tool is?
Yes, I do.
I love spreadsheets. I guess particularly Google Sheets. No matter what I've got to do, I'm just like, I'll probably just start with a spreadsheet and then nothing can go wrong.
That's true. Optimistic.
Our chancellor used to be called Spreadsheet Phil.
Really?
They just through the exchequer, and sometimes I pretend my name's Spreadsheet Phil at work.
Amazing.
You know, people don't give you a nickname, but you're like, just trying.
But I'm glad that your nickname you chose for yourself involves spreadsheets.
Yes, yeah, love them.
Researcher right there.
I know. Apparently so. Any questions? Any further questions? There you go.
How do you get teams to be open to work like in a different way? Because a lot of teams, I think, say like, yeah, we want to change things, we want to collaborate different ways. But then if you have a settled team, they're kind of used to working a certain way, and I think it's like not pushing it. So I'm just wondering, like, I'm obsessed with studying teams. I think it's amazing. So this talk was just absolutely fascinating. But I'm just wondering, how do you implement that in a workplace without being like, yeah, I'm the one who like always thinks we should make things better or different and test them and like study them. So
Yeah. Well, I think so. The attitude that I and my fellow researcher came into this with was not like we're going to come in and give you a bunch of things and say you must do it this way. But I say that sort of tongue in cheek, but I also know that at some places like that is how it's done. That you have you hire consultants potentially who come in to shape processes. I think that what we wanted to understand, where do people feel like they are struggling, and we have an activity that sort of helps us as researchers understand what they're doing, but also helps them learn from one another and rethink some of their processes. So we weren't, I mean, when we did this, certainly we were happy to suggest things like, oh, we've heard about this, and people do this in this way, and this is useful to them for these reasons. But we weren't coming in with the mindset of, we are going to fix your problems, but more, we're going to do this activity, and it will be beneficial to us in these ways, and beneficial potentially to you in these other ways. So I think once we did this, and certainly once people started making that big map, I think especially the first one, we came in and we were like, we don't know how well this is going to go. We were in New York City, and it was like really, really cold, and I don't know. We were like, is this going to go well? But I think after we made that big map, people were like, yes, and here are all my problems, and let's talk about them. And I think that really helped.
Sounds like counselling. Do people ever implement things that anybody tells them? Consultants? We definitely love consultants at my work, and I don't know whether anyone ever follows through with anything. Anyone ever follow through with anything? You know, just use your spreadsheets. That's my motto.
That's the answer, spreadsheets.
No, it's a terrible poster. Using the spreadsheet. Right, do we have time for another question? I'm looking for somebody who's more responsible than me. There we go. Well, we've got another question. We've got a hand up. So, right, final question.
Run.
Run. We don't go. Very brave man. Here you go.
Hi. My question was, do you find the teams working better in one place, like being all together, or remotely, like digital nomads?
Yeah, I think that.
Because the thing is, what I'm concerned is about innovation, like where people actually get ideas from.
So I think that, and I actually think Ali gave a good talk about this earlier in terms of sort of the differences between remote and in-person work. I think that I think a lot of it really depends, as she was saying, on the culture and on, are you making space? So one of the things that came up, because we did talk to teams where some people were in one location, some people were in another location, and often many time zones apart. And when they were not together, certainly they encountered issues. Like, as I said, we reviewed something, you weren't here, how do we communicate to you what happened and what we decided to do about it? And then how do we know that like you've also reviewed that and given input? So I think that you certainly have to set up your processes, and you pick your tools and your strategy in a way that will accommodate that. But I think that a lot of it's up to teams really being given the space to do that and to reflect on it and say, this is working, this is not working, and here's how we're going to give ourselves the latitude to be able to revisit these decisions, improve.
Perfect.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yay.
Thanks for the questions.